Hi there, Special Ed 760. I am super excited to get to start this semester with you. We're going to have a short 7 weeks together, but we're going to get a lot of information in during this time. Introducing myself again, I'm Dr. Kara Woodley. Hopefully you saw my intro video for the course, and we're going to jump right in to understanding behavior. So this reading, as with all the readings, are going to be attached to the module. So hopefully you can grab it right there and get right into it. So we're going to start with understanding behavior. And so we are going to have a set of slides. I'm going to build a set of slides every week that walks us through the reading. Please also connect with the videos and any links that are in the reading, because those are very specific and will be very helpful to you, not only in this class, but going forward in the professional practice that you'll have after you finish this course. And so my goal for us is that we build a set of readings and slides and notes and things that you can hang on to for your professional practice, even beyond this class. So let's go ahead and get started. We're talking about applied behavior analysis. You probably have heard about ABA. We're starting with the concept in this chapter. We're kind of introducing a set of things that we're going to dive deeper into in the next 7 weeks. And so we're starting with applied behavior analysis. All behavior is communication. It serves a communicative function. And so this is from Women and Kriegel. And so looking at the idea that all behavior is communication, when you start to look at your students that way, we understand that our students are trying to communicate something to us. Any behavior that we see, positive or negative, is communicating something to us. We do it as adults as well. And so if you start with that picture, it can kind of help change our mindset about how we work with students in the classroom. So I just want to kind of start there. So applied behavior analysis. ABA therapy is something that helps students learn skills and lessen problematic behaviors. That's from one of our senior lecturers, Stacey Gilpin, Dr. Stacey Gilpin, and she is one of the authors of this book that we're using this semester. And while we're not going to go all the way into ABA, if you're interested into some ABA trainings or even some more articles at the very end of this chapter, there's some links in there that can help, but I just want to kind of do a high-level overview of applied behavior analysis here. So using ABA science, educational researchers and practitioners have developed evidence-based strategies, and evidence-based strategies are really important, especially when you're working with students with special education needs, because we need to do things and interventions and behavior supports that work, that have evidence-based data behind them. And so ABA strategies provide systemic methods. They will help us identify triggers, which are setting events and antecedents. We're going to go more into that. Identify consequences that make the behavior worthwhile, because the student's doing the behavior for some reason. We need to know that. And it also helps the multidisciplinary team develop a plan to reduce challenging behaviors and increase productive behaviors. So in this course, you've probably already taken SPED 704, where you've built an FBA, you've built an IEP, you've built a behavior plan. You've probably done it in your career so far. And so I wanted you to kind of draw on any prior knowledge you have here as we're working through the pieces of this course, where we end up with a behavior intervention plan and a functional behavior assessment. Because the goal is for us to know how to identify positive behavior supports that are going to help our students in the future. And there's a series of events that we do as special educators to walk through that. And that's what we're going to be doing in this course. So I do want to touch on applied behavior analysis and the controversies that have surrounded it. You may have met somebody that has a very strong opinion about ABA, but just know that there are some very positive things based in ABA science. There are also some controversies that people still hold And so I just want to kind of touch on those and let you know that they're out there. Some of the controversies, 3 parts, I'm going to kind of say them here. Early ABA therapy strategies use punishments in addition to rewards. And so people realized that that wasn't always a good thing. ABA also focuses on eliminating behaviors rather than building skills in some people's opinions. And then some advocates also say that they dislike ABA because it attempts to make people with autism fit neurotypical standards. Some of your experience with ABA may be in the area of working with students with autism. And that's where a large part of the research has been. And so just know that these controversies and these opinions are held by some special educators out there, some educational researchers out there. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. As we are walking through this together. And so I want you to look at this lens now. Educational practitioners, which would be all of us, and researchers who use ABA now have shared that they do not seek to change how neurodiverse students think or feel. And so that's kind of pushing against the controversy we just talked about. They do try to help them build on their strengths and gifts while encouraging independence to increase their opportunities to participate in society as much as possible. And so some of the science behind ABA can be used in different ways to help us support students that have behavioral needs, not just students with autism, but students that have behavioral needs that affect the educational environment. And so one of the key behavioral principles we're going to talk about in ABA is in the analysis of setting events, antecedents, and consequences that are part of the challenging behavior. And so those 3 things are going to be pretty big parts of this chapter and what I'm asking you to do in the week's discussion. So knowing that setting events, antecedents, and consequences are part of the challenging behavior, we as educational practitioners can develop a testable hypothesis about the function of the behavior. And so we're always trying to figure out, why is the student doing something? What is the function of the behavior? Are they trying to get something? Are they trying to avoid something? Are they trying to get somebody's attention? And we'll talk more about the 4 reasons for somebody's behavior in a minute. And so key behavioral principles, ABA. Okay, so in this chapter, this reading and the work that we're going to do during these few weeks, we're going to look at ABA principles and PBIS approaches and how those together can reduce challenging behaviors, help develop socially appropriate replacement behaviors. If you're not familiar with PBIS, I can send you some more resources on that, but I'm going to use a lot of acronyms in special ed. We use a lot of acronyms. So if there's ever something that you're like, I don't know what that means, please just reach out and let me know. So PBIS stands for Positive Behavior Intervention Supports. Most schools have some level of PBIS, if it's not just true PBIS, but some kind of positive behavior intervention support. So just kind of keep that framework in your mind. I want to start with antecedents and setting events. And so when we're doing our behavior plan, I'm asking you to look at some antecedents, maybe the consequences, maybe the function of the behavior, just to kind of get a big level overview when you're looking at your students' reasons for the behavior. We're going to talk about antecedents, setting events, and how they're different. So an antecedent could be something that a child takes away another child's toy. A teacher makes a verbal request of a student. Maybe a fire drill happens. Maybe a weather event like thunder and lightning. Maybe the lunch menu runs out of the child's favorite food while the child is in the lunch line. So an antecedent is something that happens, and the immediate effect is the behavior. And so in the antecedent, something happens, and the immediate effect is the behavior. So it's almost immediate. It happens right away. A setting event is something that is a little bit different. Examples of setting events would be lack of sleep, illness, changes in schedule, hunger, mood change, trauma impact, mental health, microaggressions, discriminations, temporary and or long-term states of mind. Now, I want you to remember, I'm just giving a high-level overview in this. And so if you haven't done the reading, go ahead and do the reading because it talks a lot more about antecedents and setting events in there. This is just a kind of a high-level overview. So a setting event is something that is pervasive. It's around the student in their life. There might be trauma, there might be mental health things, there might be some kind of oppression, there might be some discrimination. Maybe there's the students are experiencing homelessness or food insecurity. Those kind of things are setting events. And so The effects of setting events, we often don't see that this is happening, like something happens, we're talking about a trigger, and the behavior happens a little bit later. And so antecedents and setting events together we can also see a behavior happen immediately. But looking at behavior, just kind of giving you a overview of what ABA defines behavior as, is something that everybody does. So everything that people do, behavior is something everybody does. Anything that can be observed and changes in the environment or the person is behavior. Okay. So ABA does not include intentions, labels, emotions, diagnoses. And the book goes into more into this. Something that is not behavior is hurting others, being mean, being angry, being lazy, being obsessive, attention seeking. Okay. And so ABA says behaviors are described as only what others see or hear. ABA also does not use value statements about the impact of behavior. And so as we're going further here, just know the consequences of a behavior, result of a display of a behavior are consequences, okay? We're all familiar with consequences. They either strengthen or weaken the preceding behavior. Remember, we have those antecedents and we have those setting events. An antecedent is that something happens at school, an immediate effect is the behavior. A setting event may be something that's pervasive. And then you have also maybe an antecedent, and you could say, oh, Hayes was tired. He is currently living in a hotel. And so they don't have, a stable home environment. And then, so that would be the setting event. And then the antecedent would be something like they ran out of his favorite food in the lunch line. And so he acted out and started throwing food everywhere. So the behavior there was that the students started throwing behavior everywhere, but you can also point to the antecedent and also the setting event. The consequence of this behavior can help us determine the possible function of the behavior. Why did he do that? Why did he do that? I put an additional resource here that's not in the reading, just to talk about the 4 functions of behavior if you're not familiar. Lots of researchers say that there are 4 functions of behavior. We do it for attention, escape, access to a tangible object, or sensory needs. Perhaps an example I just gave about Hayes, perhaps the issue was a sensory need. He was hungry, and so they ran out of the food they wanted, and he got upset. The antecedent, we can point to the setting event. We have the consequence, and that was the function of the behavior. So associated mental health disorders. We're going to pivot just a little bit because I want to talk about how these things kind of play into students with behavioral needs. And right now I'm going to focus on emotional behavior disabilities, EBDs. In your district, they might be called something a little bit different. I've heard them called EDs, like emotional disturbances. I've heard them called behavioral emotional disability. So you switch the B and the E. It just kind of depends on what your district, what your school district, what your, maybe the state you're living in, maybe what they call it. So I'm going to stay with EBD because that's what IDEA 2004 says. It says it's the eligibility category that's most often used for students who may have a mental health need that causes an educational need. I want to stop right here and say, I know that some students can have a mental health need and not need an IEP or not have a 504, and not all students who have emotional behavior disabilities may need an IEP all the time. Okay. And so remember, this is very individualized. So when we're talking about antecedents, behaviors, consequences, setting events, all of these things, we're also kind of doing a high level overview here of the associated mental health disorders that can help us understand things like antecedents and setting events. So I also want to say that we know as special educators, as educational researchers, not a single factor rarely leads to a behavioral need that impacts learning. So if there's one instance, maybe this child did something kind of out of character, started a food fight, threw a chair, something like that, that is not a reason to say, oh, the kid has an emotional behavioral disability and we need to put him in special education. Know that one single factor rarely leads to that behavioral need. We're looking at for a pattern of things that are happening. And so as we're kind of pivoting a little bit and talking about associated mental health disorders in the reading, I want you just to know that This is all very individualized. We have to use that multidisciplinary team to look at all the data with a student, and so that we can make sure that we are considering all of the reasons for a child's behavior, and with the ultimate goal of giving them the supports that they need. So when we are looking at a student's behavior, we need to also understand if there are any associated mental health disorders that may need support in the classroom. So, sorry. So going back, looking at, sorry for the slides, kind of went crazy there a little bit. So just kind of an overview, associated mental health disorders. These conditions are often present in students who qualify for special education under the label EBD, but not always. And so I just want to kind of throw some out there: anxiety disorders, bipolar disorders, conduct disorders, eating disorders, obsessive compulsive disorders, and psychotic disorders. This is also to say, if a student has these disorders, they don't have to have an IEP, okay? It's just that there's an educational need there. And so I want to always say that caveat, because we don't have to say that child has anxiety, so they need an IEP. If there's not an educational need, the student doesn't need that eligibility area. And so students only need IEPs and supports under IDEA if they have an educational need. And so we're looking at the whole student here. I also want to talk about the impact of trauma when we're talking about supporting students with behavioral needs. So Deteri in 2017 shares these points about trauma. It is very important to consider not only if there's a mental health concern, like we just went over, but if there's impact of trauma, because that can be an important setting event, just as there can be a mental health need. Trauma, we know, can affect the brain. It changes the brain, the way that children do things, the way adults do things. Adults can experience trauma. Children can experience trauma. Deteri says that children need stability in loving relationships. Vulnerability, they have vulnerability in witnessing violence. Hi there. Okay, so going on with trauma. Sorry, my dog was a little bit loud. So looking at trauma again. So we need to be aware that trauma can happen to both children and adults, but also often with the children, when children are exceptionally vulnerable in witnessing violence, abuse, and neglect, that can be a source of trauma. Children can believe that abuse is their fault. Children will adapt to scary and overwhelming circumstances. And remember, I told you it changes the brain. And so prolonged exposure to these scary and overwhelming circumstances can lead to toxic stress. We know that babies can sense fear and traumatic stress. We know that traumatic memories are stored in the brain differently than everyday memories. And we also know that flashbacks can trigger intense feelings that bring back distressing experiences. Children can also have flashbacks at quiet times, bedtimes, that could cause dysregulated behavior. And so maybe if a child's experienced trauma, they don't sleep at night. And so they come to us very tired in the morning. And so because of the collective setting event, there could be an antecedent, a quick trigger, and then we set off a behavior. And so we need to be thinking about those things and be knowledgeable about this so that we can use all of this information to support the student. And so looking at the impact of trauma on health, we know that students that experience trauma have physical symptoms, emotional symptoms, inconsistent academic performance, unpredictable and impulsive behavior, inappropriate reaction to bells, physical contact, door slamming. I've had students like that where there's an issue with fire drills. And so we need to make sure that we're supporting the student in a way that can help them have a safe reaction to fire drills, bells, like our normal bells, like on a middle school or high school schedule. Students can also have intense reactions to flashbacks, like if something triggers them that they've read in a curriculum or in something that they're doing in a school setting. We also have seen that students may believe that others are violating their personal space if there's some kind of traumatic experience there. They can have inappropriate reaction to correction. They can fight when criticized or teased by peers. They can have difficulty with transitions and or change. So it's important to consider these things when we're looking at students and the reasons for their behavior. Also looking at trauma impacts on learning. We know that Students can have lower academic achievement. Students with trauma have inconsistent academic performance, a higher rate of school absences, increased dropout rates, more suspensions and expulsions, lower reading ability, intrusive and interrupting thoughts leading to interrupted sleep, and chronic exposure to trauma can adversely affect attention, memory, and cognition. So when we're looking at a way forward, how to support these students, we also need to understand that some of our students have experienced systemic oppression. These can lead to and can heighten the impacts of trauma. And when we're looking at this, this is the culturally responsive part of what we're going to be looking at this semester. We're looking at racialized oppression, gender-based oppression, trauma of poverty, food insecurity, experiences being unhoused. Maybe there's some identity-based oppressions, especially the anti-trans homophobic attacks, the laws that have been being passed across the country, school shootings are an example. And also state police violence against Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian Pacific Islander community members. So those are examples of systemic oppression a lot of our students may have experience in their lives. And so in the reading, you'll see that there's some research by that in the state of Minnesota, and we'll talk about this a little bit later. The students that are students of color, so students who are Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian Pacific Islander community members make up 1/3 of our population in Minnesota, but they are 2/3 of the population that are receiving disciplinary expulsions and suspensions. And so that is a problem. We're going to talk about that a little bit later, because the way we react to students' behavior and support them in schools can have an effect, even if they're in special education, can have an effect on their future later. And so we talk a little bit about the school to prison pipeline in this chapter, and I want to offer more resources for that whenever we get there. If you'd like more information about that. I also want to say that, and with the way forward, teachers can help counter factors like this and the other ones I've talked about by helping students experience positive, safe relationships, meeting physical needs, such as getting them connected with resources that can provide them with food, clothing, shelter, any counseling, those kinds of impacts. We can be supportive in the way to get them connected to the resources that they need. And so I also want to talk a little bit about intersectionality here. And so if you've not heard the term intersectionality, know that Merriam-Webster, our dictionary, defines it as the complex cumulative way in which multiple effects of multiple forms of discrimination, such as racism, sexism, and classism, combine, overlap, or intersect, especially in the experiences of marginalized individuals or groups. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that and how that has to do with behavior. You might be wondering now, why is she talking about intersectionality and systemic oppression when we're talking about behavior? Because all of this is connected whenever we're looking at supporting students, not only students of color, but students who have experienced oppression, or maybe are experiencing trauma, or may have a mental health need. All of these things are connected. And so if we were drawing maybe a figurative line from getting from applied behavior analysis to the end of this lecture, I hope that you can start seeing experiences in your classroom setting about how all of these things can kind of be interworking, and so that we can support students who have behavioral needs in the classroom. And so intersectionality is multiple and intersecting identities. We all have multiple identities. I am a white female educator, special educator. And so you may have a different identity that is different from mine or similar to mine. And so we know that intersecting identities inform how we see the world. And so culture, it's not a monolith. We all have different culture, beliefs, norms, practices, and know that culture holds many variation and diverse ideas. And knowing these things can inform the way that we work with students in the classroom, especially students with behavioral needs. And so when we're looking at intersectionality, just know that in the majority of school settings across the United States, because that's where the majority of educational research is done, we see appropriate behavior. It typically reflects white middle-class cultural norms and values. It's well documented in research. It's reflected in educational systems across the United States in behavior, communication, classroom dynamics, family engagement practices. And this results in a cultural gap. And you're going to see this in one of the IRIS modules that we're going to do. If you'd like more information about this, this is kind of where my research interests lie, is with intersectionality and culturally responsive teaching in special education. And so I'd love to share more with you if you're interested in having a deeper discussion. I also want you to consider effects of systemic inequities, where students might feel misunderstood, marginalized. There are higher rates of discipline referrals, higher dropout rates. Whenever we have systemic inequities within and without special education, it leads to overrepresentation of some race and ethnic backgrounds in special education and emotional behavioral disabilities. This is where I was talking earlier a little bit about our students of color, who represent 1/3 of the population of Minnesota. I could also give you data on Texas, where I lived before, but we know that some race and ethnicities are overrepresented in special education, especially in emotional behavior disorder eligibility. And there's also underrepresentation of students who really need special education services, but screening assessments may not be available due to a child's native language. And so I want you to kind of start thinking about this as we're working to support students with behavioral needs. Data says from Federal Reserve Bank of Minnesota, students of color are sometimes treated differently than their white peers. Black and American Indian students equal 1/3 of Minnesota's overall student population, but receive 2/3 of all suspensions and expulsions. Again, I'm just going to reiterate, I was talking about the school to prison pipeline earlier. There is a well-documented, well-researched information about how the way we work with students of color, especially in the classrooms, can affect the school to prison pipeline, where we see students that receive a lot of discipline referrals. Maybe we don't understand the functions of their behavior. And so we're seeing violations of the code of conduct. They're receiving disciplines, they're receiving expulsions, suspensions. And we know how in some schools that you receive 2 detentions, then you get a suspension, or there's code of conduct that says if you do this, then you get so many days of suspended. When we're talking about students in special education, we know there's a parameter. Once we get to 10 days, we have to determine whether the behaviors were a part of the function of, or part of their disability. Whenever we have students that within or without, in or out of special education, we have to consider that the way that we are disciplining them is effective, because it can lead to the school to prison pipeline. A student that gets massive amounts of disciplinary consequences like detentions, expulsion, suspensions, maybe putting out of the classroom, maybe a lunch detention because they're having a behavioral need, that can lead to the prison pipeline, where we know that students that receive a lot of behavioral discipline in a pervasive amount will often leads to them dropping out of school. When they drop out of school, they have experiencing poverty, homelessness, maybe even criminal activity. And if you look at the research that's with the ability, the reading abilities of people in prison, you can see that a lot of the data will say that students who receive disciplinary actions and maybe their behavior wasn't understood, or they didn't understand, or teachers were, they'll say teachers were really mean, or teachers didn't do this, or my principal didn't do this. We can see that there's a school to prison pipeline, and that research is very interesting if you're interested in something and hearing more about that. But it all leads back to the way that we work with students in the classroom, because we need to understand that their behavior is telling us something, back to that communicative part of a function. So we can kind of look at behavior as the students are trying to tell me something, rather than reacting immediately, whether or not the student's in a special education or not. Then we can change the trajectory for students who may be at risk of a variety of different things, or a variety of dropping out. Because we know when students drop out and aren't at school, then they have a higher rate of entering the carceral system. And so that's very interesting research. If you are interested in looking at that, I'm happy to share more. And so effects of systemic inequities here. I want to just consider the subjectivity of eligibility areas. We know that there are subjectivities of eligibility areas in the areas of other health impairment and also emotional behavior disabilities. Educators often focus on modifying behavior, solving a problem. So thinking about in your classroom, if you're already teaching, if there was a student, and I know I experienced this when I was in the classroom, if there's a student and there's an issue and he's acting out or she's acting out, and there's an issue and you need them to be removed from your classroom because they're disrupting the learning environment, we need to figure out how we can address the learning issue and supporting maybe an undiagnosed disability or mental health need rather than just reacting to the behavioral need. We need to do all of those things at the same time, which creates a difficult dynamic, but you are doing that very thing in this graduate level class, and you're asking questions and you're looking at ways to be a better educator just by the very nature of you being here in this graduate level class. And so as teachers, we're lifelong learners, and we want to make sure that we are doing better for our students, and we're changing the practices that need to be changed, and we are sharing knowledge with other educators. So another effect of systemic inequities, looking more about intersectionality and kind of where it came from. Kimberly Crenshaw, in about 1989, authored the term intersectionality to describe the experience of Black womanhood. We talked a little bit about earlier, like my identity would be I am a white middle-class female who is an educator. And so your identity is probably different from mine. And looking at Kimberly Crenshaw's, her example is that she's a Black and a female, and those identities coexist and they describe a person's experience. So they are not separate, but they intersect. And so that's kind of where intersectionality comes in. Examples could be of intersectionality could be gender identity, mental health, disabilities, and culture. All of those intersect. They are not separate from each other, and they all help the person explain their identity and how those things all work together. And so we cannot separate them from each other. That's where intersectionality comes in. And a way forward, a lot of information I've presented today, but a way forward is to humanize learning. Human interaction, identities, emotions, cognitions, and pedagogy must combine to shape learning so that students experience the value and love of learning through diversity and resources that support them. You as an educator, knowing that there's a lot of things that are going into a student's behavior. There's a lot of reasons. There may be an antecedent, there may be a setting event, maybe multiple setting events, multiple antecedents. There might be trauma, there might be mental health concerns, there might be identity issues, and where a student is learning to identify in different ways. And it's our job as teachers to help shape that in a positive and safe way so that students can realize their goals and their dreams and their love for learning. That's why we're here. That's why we're doing this. And so restorative practices is a great way to repair relationships and find that root analysis of the problems and to establish that sense of community, which you might already be doing in your classroom. And I'd love to hear about it. So talking a little bit more about a functional behavior assessment, we're going to pivot a little bit again here. And so that FBA, again, with alphabet soup, we're going to be doing this in the class later. I just want to kind of touch on it at the end of our chapter here today. The FBA leads us to the BIP. The BIP is that behavior intervention plan. This plan, once we've considered all the things we talked about today as a multidisciplinary evaluative team, special educator, we get to that BIP, and this is the plan that contains positive and proactive interventions that can help the student learn new, more acceptable ways of getting their needs met or their wants and desires, that object or the attention that they want. BIPs must contain a replacement behavior that addresses the same function as a problem behavior. It must also teach supports that reinforce the desired replacement behavior. So as you're starting that behavior action plan with us this week, we're going to be leading to the BIP. Okay, the FBA and the BIP, and that behavior and action plan is that first part of it. And so looking here again, functional behavior assessment, the FBA, educators must consider cultural responsiveness when understanding social, emotional, and behavioral challenges. I talked a lot about that today, that cultural responsiveness, all of those pieces, intersectionality. Also, I've talked about trauma and mental health needs and antecedents and setting events. We know that functional behavior assessment helps educators understand the reason for a student's challenging behavior. So when we're considering all those things, antecedents, setting events, trauma, mental health needs, identities, maybe there's some intersectionality needs that need to be addressed to help a student to feel positive about their identities. We know that with an FBA, an educator can create a behavior intervention plan that has those positive behavior supports, that we're replacing a behavior. So I've given you a lot of information today, and this might kind of feel like a whirlwind, and that's okay. And so we're going to be walking through this together. If you have any questions, this was a high-level overview of how we're going to be kind of moving forward this 7 weeks. Let me know. Don't be afraid to watch this again. Pause, write down questions, and ask me. And I look forward to a great 7 weeks with you. It's I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you are here to improve not only your own teaching practice, but I look forward to learning with you and from you as a fellow educator so that we can improve the outcomes for our students. Y'all have a great week, and we'll talk to you later.